Podcast.
Herald and News, your news now.
The Herald and News.
Empowering the community.
Basin Views.
Herald and News, your news now. Klamath Falls, Oregon.
The Herald and News.
Podcast. Empowering the community and serving the Klamath Basin. This is the Herald and News Basin Views podcast. Greetings and welcome to Basin Views, a Herald and News podcast featuring interviews with local experts discussing issues important to the Klamath Basin. I'm Kurt Liedtke with the Herald and News. This week we are joined by Phil Studenberg, attorney and city council member by trade, here to discuss, among other issues, the marijuana petition that will be on the Klamath Falls ballot in the upcoming November election. Phil, thank you for taking some time out of your schedule to join us.
Thank you.
Well, I always like to start these things off with getting to know our guests a little bit better before we will delve into the topic at hand. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I grew up in South Dakota. I went to law school at the University of South Dakota. Came out here in 1978, so I'm on my 40th year of practicing law. Got elected to the city council 2 years ago. The first public office I've held. I've served in a lot of positions with criminal defense organizations and things like that, and I've been real active with the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, the Democratic Party, and I've just been a pretty active citizen here for 40 years and finally decided to run for office.
The role of both city council member and attorney in a community this small, there must be some occasional overlap from time to time, right?
There definitely is, especially in my role as since I'm oversight for the city police department. Quite often I have criminal cases that involve city police officers, and obviously I have to be careful about administrative matters involving discipline of police officers and things like that. I've got to be real careful about conflicts of interest, especially. But it's also helpful that I can bring to my supervision of the police department my experience as a criminal defense lawyer as well. And I have great respect for the city police here.
Well, we have less than a month to go until it is election day, and there's lots of issues nationally and locally. And the big one that I wanted to bring you in to talk about today is Measure 18112, which is the opt-in, opt-out issue associated with recreational marijuana in Klamath Falls. Let's first of all delve into what Measure 91 was when that passed a couple of years ago and what that established.
Well, Measure 91 allowed for retail marijuana sales in the state of Oregon, but it also had the opt-out clause, and most of eastern Oregon counties took that opt-out clause, decided they didn't want to be involved in that, and including the county and the city of Klamath. I tried to persuade the city council to override that, which they could have done. I was the only councilman that supported it, so we decided to put it on the ballot and see if the people would vote to overturn it. When we had the county-wide vote that it actually passed in the city, it was defeated in the county this last time. So we have great hope that we can get the city residents to lift the moratorium.
So the opt-in, opt-out was any area that had more total voters more than 55% against, right, in the Measure 91 vote, that they had the choice to opt out. Yes. Keeping the prohibition of recreational marijuana use in place. That seems like it would cause a lot of confusion for places like, not in Klamath, but our neighboring county, Lake County, where the county opted out, but the community of Lakeview opted in.
Right, so and that may be where we're going to be at here, too.
Depending on what street you stand on, if you're in the urban growth boundary versus in town, it's either legal or illegal. I'm sure from a law enforcement standpoint, that's got to be really confusing, too.
Yeah, I think it is. Well, the state laws right now are fairly confusing. We've had a couple where people were arrested because the officer didn't understand how you count immature plants, things like that. The whole area is pretty gray, and we need to get that cleared up. But certainly if we pass this in the city, people are going to have to figure out where they can and cannot have retail establishments, and it's going to take a little work.
So what was the argument for opting out when Klamath Falls chose not to participate?
Well, I heard a lot of talk about the workforce. They were concerned the economic development people thought it was going to be a problem for having qualified employees when we're trying to bring in new economic development. Lately, I've been hearing a lot of talk about odor. There's a lot of concern about smells, which the cities that have set up these dispensaries there's pretty good technology to deal with odors, but odor seems to come up a lot. Then there's a lot of talk about kids having access to marijuana, that if there are retail establishments, that young people are going to be able to get a hold of marijuana more easily, and that kind of baffles me. I see it as the opposite. I think if we can regulate the marijuana trade and make sure that young people aren't buying it, we'd be better off than we are with the black market now.
And there's kind of a whole history behind that, too, that we can delve into in a little bit. But let's talk about this petition that went around this year. Now, medicinal marijuana is legal. That's state law. That's established.
In the city, that's correct.
There were some people who wanted to readdress the opt-out for recreational marijuana. Can you explain how that kind of all came about?
We're seeing, I think, that the medicinal marijuana situation is going away and is actually being subsumed, eaten up by the recreational marijuana. We had the law passed that everybody could have 4 plants or 8 ounces of marijuana. All adults could. But a lot of people don't have access. If they're not good at growing, they need to have a place to buy their 8 ounces of marijuana. And right now they have to go to Medford or Chiloquin or someplace else to do it rather than getting it locally. And we lose out on the benefits of that economically. We lose out on the availability of marijuana to people that want to have a right to and want to purchase it here locally. So a group of us decided, we tried to get the city council, as I said. I kind of got a sense of the council to see if anybody was willing to change their mind on it. They weren't. So then we just started gathering signatures for the petition, and the people on the city council said if the voters say they want it, then we'll back it, but they want to hear from the voters.
So the voters spoke through petition, and now there is going to be on the November election ballot, Measure 18112. Could you explain exactly what Measure 18112 does, or what
it allows it allows for the city to license, and it allows for people to have retail marijuana sales to people over 21 within the city limits. The city can regulate it with reasonable regulations, such as setbacks, number of facilities, that type of thing. But it would allow for recreational marijuana to be available in the city, and it would set up an advisory council of people that use marijuana. The police and various other groups would be represented on this advisory council.
So who has been in support of this and who's been opposed to it?
Well, there aren't any. I know the Democratic Party has been working with us, and there's a group called Klamath Strong, and it's a citizens group that we organized. I don't know that anybody else has formally endorsed it. There are a lot of people opposed to it. I think Sky Lakes has been real active in doing that. The economic development people were opposed to it, but I noticed they took a neutral stance, at least one of them did, which I thought took to be a very positive sign. I've always thought this was something that would help our economic development, and I was disappointed that Casita and the Chamber of Commerce were opposed to it. They seem to be reconsidering that, and apparently their members are split pretty evenly on it.
Economic impact is something that this area has certainly felt a lot. The decline of the timber industry drastically changed the Klamath Basin as we know it, and we continue to feel that impact.
I was here when warehouses were shut down, and that was a huge impact.
Yeah. So this is a potential boon, and we've been seeing it in other communities that chose to opt in. What have we seen in terms of tax benefits and economic impact in communities that have chosen to opt in now that Measure 91's been in place for a couple of years?
It's bringing in significant money and jobs, not just directly into the retail business, but also all the auxiliary jobs, construction, water, all kinds of auxiliary jobs that don't necessarily touch marijuana, but they would be involved when people are building their grow sites, they're setting up their commercial activities. The figures I have, there'd be 100 jobs directly in the marijuana retail business. So there'd be about $350,000 raised in taxes, and that doesn't count all the auxiliary fertilizer, equipment, construction
So right now we're just talking about the city of Klamath Falls itself, but is there an effort that if this is successful to then maybe readdress it at a county level?
Yes. Yeah, we definitely, that'll be the next step. If we can pass this, then we're going to move on to the county.
Now, we've seen other areas deal with this opt-in, opt-out issue. I was very involved when I used to work for the newspaper out in Lakeview with Lake County's debate over this. And it's been fascinating to watch because their county chose to opt out, like Klamath County did, right, but the town of Lakeview opted in. And that created a very long debate of figuring out just how do we actually regulate this. The OLCC, which is in charge of establishing the rules for this, hasn't exactly been helpful in creating a standard for the rules that each community should set. So they had to figure out things like distance, should we establish certain parameters regarding proximity to schools and to churches. And actually, the rules that they set, they realized that they'd made it impossible to build a dispensary based on the proximity rules that they established, because there were no commercial zones left. So they had to kind of readdress that and reduce those links. But what parameters in terms of regulation have been at least preliminarily discussed at this point should 18-112 pass?
I know that the county actually went through that process anticipating that it might pass in the county, so they're ahead of the game. We haven't done any real work as far as how we're going to do it. That's going to start if it passes in November. It won't take effect till January. We're going to have to do some serious work in trying to figure out distances, setbacks, odor control, nuisance control, things like that. And we haven't really done any. The assumption is it isn't going to pass, I guess, so nobody's really anticipating working on it right now.
Has there been much communication with other communities and counties that have opted in terms of trying to figure out what to do?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
One issue that always comes up anytime it's tax season and anytime that it's election season, people never seem to remember what part of town they live in, whether they're in Klamath Falls or right, Altamont, until it actually makes sense. Now, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if you know or not, if people who live in the Altamont boundary or the urban growth boundary are included on the ballot to be able to vote for Measure 18-112.
Yeah, I honestly don't know, but I'm going to go talk to the clerk's office when we're done here, because it hadn't occurred to me that there was an issue, but I see that there is.
Medicinal versus recreational. Enforcement of that. Medicinal has been in place so long now in the state of Oregon that there's kind of established laws and rules for it and regulation. But since you are involved with law enforcement in your role, have you heard a lot of complaints from officers in terms of how they manage recreational versus medicinal and how they approach it? Or
I think the medicinal is, as you say, is pretty well established. Unfortunately, I think it's going to disappear to the recreational market, because it doesn't. Most people who are using it medicinally, if they can have 4 plants or 8 ounces recreationally, there's no need to go through all the hoops of getting the doctor's statement. So I'm afraid that Ed Medina's got one of the few medicinal stores left in the state of Oregon, and he can see the handwriting on the wall. Eventually, the recreational is just going to eat up the medicinal, and OLCC will be running the show instead of Department of Human Services.
So once the votes are in, if this passes, what's the next step? What does Phil Studenberg jump into action with as both an attorney heavily involved in the city and city council member?
Well, the first thing we're going to have to do, and it's going to be in 2 months, we're going to have some reasonable regulations in place so that somebody can come down and get a license from the city on January 1st or whatever the date is in January. We have to be able to have regulations in place, and I'm sure our staff can do that. We have a very competent city staff, so that's going to be a lot of work for the months of November, December, January, trying to get everything in place so it's a fair system.
What do you feel people should know about either recreational marijuana use or Measure 18-112 that perhaps isn't out there in the common conversations?
Well, we're seeing a lot of stuff about attractive nuisance, advertising for kids, and that's simply not allowed in Oregon. You can't have the gummy bears and things like that in Oregon. That's something that the opponents are coming up with from somewhere else, because Oregon's very strict on that. They need to know that people under 21 are not going to be able to buy marijuana. And there have been some efforts to catch stores that are selling to kids. The first time around it was pretty bad. Now it looks like the stores are in compliance throughout the state, and they're doing a pretty good job of regulating control and giving access to the kids. Of course, we have no way of stopping parents who have marijuana in their house now from their kids getting a hold of it. That's a parenting thing. That's not a commercial thing.
Politically, could there be something where even if after this passes by community vote, that council decides a further opt-out move or a prohibition of it, or it could be overturned down the line again? Or
I don't think so. I don't think there's a provision for doing that. I think once it's approved, it's in. The only thing they could do is try it, and if the city council is really adamant about it, they could try to regulate it away, make the regulations so stiff that we couldn't have retail stores. But I think they'd be setting themselves up for a lawsuit by doing that.
Which is exactly what happened in Lakeview. Well, the history of marijuana prohibition I find really fascinating. As a student of history, it has a lot of ties in the 1920s alcohol prohibition era. And then when that was inevitably overturned, a lot of those same advocates then turned their sights on this. It has ties to pre-civil rights segregation it was becoming popular among jazz and black culture, and it was a way to view that. And William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul, and he felt threatened by hemp products and hemp paper threatening his newspaper industry. So he used a lot of his political influence in his newspaper industry to really drive this. Whereas the alcohol prohibition ended after about a decade or so, a little over a decade, and it was overturned. People saw that really drove crime and a black market, and it really didn't help in preventing it. Why do you think that marijuana prohibition hasn't followed that same course? Why it's stayed true for now going on 80 plus years?
Yeah, I think there's a direct parallel to prohibition, and I think the reason, frankly, is it's been used as a way of keeping different races suppressed. What Harry Anslinger did to Billie Holiday is a classic example. He destroyed the woman's life with her drug addiction, and he used the war on drugs because he thought she was rising above her station, if you will, and she died chained to a hospital bed because she had an opiate addiction. At the same time, Joe McCarthy was getting heroin delivered to him in the Senate. So there's clearly, and then it came around again in the Nixon era. And I think if you read what John Ehrlichman had to say, he said the war on drugs was used to suppress the hippies, the anti-war movement, and the minorities, and to break them up. And it served a useful purpose where alcohol didn't serve that purpose in the way that drugs do.
And that's continued to this day. And there's a lot of hysteria that I certainly saw when I was in Lakeview, and we started to see it now here, Measure 18112, coming up on the ballot here as well, of some people treating marijuana like it's the final sign of the apocalypse, which I find to be strange and kind of fascinating when, amidst all those conversations of how this is going to bring so many drugs into the community and all that, no one in the course of those conversations seems to ever be talking about the massive meth epidemic that we have going on.
And heroin's coming back for some reason. And I see that in my work. There's a lot of heroin overdoses. And I think that's directly tied to the opioid crisis, because we got young people especially that get on painkillers and can't get off of them, and then when they can no longer get them, they resort to heroin as a street drug. But yeah, I see marijuana as more like going home and having a cocktail at night, and it is not comparable at all to heroin or to certainly meth or cocaine, which is also making a comeback.
You mentioned opioids, and pain-killing drugs have grown exponentially over the last few years in their potency and also addictiveness, and that we're seeing that as such a drastic situation of overdoses from opioids, and that's opening the door. That's the real gateway drug that I see. Everyone calls marijuana a gateway drug, but what's being prescribed sometimes seems like it's far more lethal.
Yeah, I agree.
Marijuana versus hemp is another thing that gets caught up in the conversation here. Now, hemp has no THC, so Senator Ron Wyden, who's been a big advocate for hemp growing as the new ag industry, every time he holds a town hall, he says the same thing. You're as likely to get high smoking hemp as you are your own T-shirt. During World War II, farmers were strongly encouraged to grow hemp. It was used for rope, it was used for parachutes, it was used to help fuel the war effort. And now there's so much hindrance to farmers being able to grow hemp, yet it's one of the most malleable resources around. It'll grow anywhere. It grows fast. You can grow the same amount of pulp for paper with hemp in 3 months' time as would take 10 years to grow from trees. There's so many products from it. Why do you think that hemp is still so limited in its use when it's shown time after time to be such a valuable product from an agricultural standpoint?
Yeah, as you said, William Randolph Hearst had a lot to do with it. It was very popular before, and he got a hold of it, and he changed the market. It's kind of like when they tore up all the public transit systems to benefit private car owners. It's the same thing. It's where the money is, and unfortunately now hemp and the war on drugs has kind of gotten it confused, so that people can't make that distinction very easily. And hemp could be a life-saving drug, not a drug, a life-saving plant for the American economy if we give it a chance.
A lot of farmers that may be struggling, if they grew hemp, it's easy to grow. It'll grow in almost any environment, and it can be used for 1,000 different products.
Yeah.
So
and Mitch McConnell supports it, but he hasn't been able to get a bill passed.
Yeah, well, that's Congress for you, I guess, right now. Well, and speaking of politics, because this issue is so intertwined politically, a lot of people don't want to address it because of those drug misconceptions. On a local level, being a member of City Council, how do you see the political tides turning in regards to marijuana use in Klamath Basin?
I think they are turning, and I think the old guard, if you will, in the city is having a hard time letting go of some of their control. But I do see the community is changing. I think the economy is improving. We are changing, and the face of Klamath Falls is becoming different. And I think some people are scared of that. As I said, the old guard, the money class, don't want to see it change, but it's going to happen. It's inevitable, and I think inevitably we will have retail marijuana.
If this does pass, how quickly do you see it taking hold before we start seeing recreational marijuana businesses in town?
Oh, there are people ready to go on January 1, I think. If we can give them a license, there are people that are ready to do it.
Now, OLCC's involvement in that process, is that going to help or hinder? Because we've been hearing all sorts of conflicting information in terms of people trying to pursue business licenses, having issues with OLCC while they're still trying to figure out how exactly they want to regulate this.
Yeah, they need to get their act together because they're causing people money. They're interrupting businesses and people who want to invest sums of money. So OLCC really does need to get. Maybe they need more employees. Maybe they need more inspectors. I don't know what they need, but the legislature's got to get their act together and figure out what the regulations are. I know that Prodzansky is talking about setting up a system where Oregon could export marijuana to other states that are legal, which would be a huge, whole different thing. So the legislature's got to figure out what they're doing and get some regulations passed that everybody can understand so business people know what they're doing.
As an attorney, do you see any potential legal challenges that could come down the road if this passes or if it doesn't pass?
I don't know that there's a legal challenge to the moratorium. We looked at that when it was passed, and we thought there might be some equal protection arguments, frankly. I mean, there is a constitutional right to have the same rights as other citizens, and my initial impression was the moratorium denied people of Klamath County the same rights that people of Jackson County have. I don't it's not been filed. I don't think it will be. So I don't think there's any real legal challenges either way coming down the pike. So.
The fact that Klamath County and Klamath Falls have opted out so far, how much do you think has been lost through economic benefits, tax surplus? I can speak for Lakeview. There's a company out there called the 42nd Group
I know those guys.
that had looked at possibly coming to Klamath County, and instead they built their operation in Lakeview. They're now hiring around 100 people and bringing a lot of revenue into that community. That's a lot of jobs for a small community.
It is.
What do you think that Klamath Falls and Klamath County have missed out on to date by not participating in Measure 91?
I think we missed. We haven't completely missed the boat, but certainly the businesses that have been established in Lakeview, Chiloquin, Medford are going to be way ahead of the game, and we're going to be playing a catch-up game. We lost an enormous amount of money and economic development and jobs when we didn't pass this.
Do you find it odd that for an area that has struggled to find new economic opportunities in the wake of the collapse of the timber industry would deny a potential new economic boon?
Yeah, it baffles me, frankly. And I hear the Casita and the Chamber, and I'm not picking on them. I think they do a good job. But if they want to talk about improving our economy, why would you turn away a source of income, a source of revenue, and a source of a lot of jobs for the county just because it's got some stigma attached to it? They don't seem to act that way about alcohol. They don't act that way about tobacco. These are businesses that there's a market for them, and they should be regulated just like tobacco and alcohol, and the benefits should be there for the citizens that choose to use it.
Well, Measure 18112 is not the only issue on the ballot coming up in November. Are there other current concerns that the City Council has or that you have that are coming up in the November vote?
Oh, well, I know they've got all these things on sanctuary cities. There's some tax measures. I think there's a gun control. There's something about guns on the ballot. I haven't followed that closely, but the city hasn't really taken an active position on any of the other ones. I know the sheriff has come out against the sanctuary city thing. Chris Caber has, but the city hasn't taken a position on any of that.
So removing your personal views from a standpoint and taking your seat as both a city council member and an attorney, give me the arguments for and against voting in favor or against Measure 18112. From your level of expertise, what advice would you give to people who are still on the fence about voting?
Well, I think the obvious reasons for voting for it are the ones we've talked about. There's jobs, there's economic development, there's regulation to get rid of or at least to reduce the black market. On the against side, and I understand these people's fears are legitimate. They're afraid kids are going to get more access to marijuana. They're afraid that it's a gateway drug, that it's going to be creating. You're going to have dispensaries downtown with people standing around smoking joints, and the smells are going to be bad, and it's going to hurt the appearance of downtown. Those are all legitimate concerns that I understand. I don't think that they are going to come true, but that's the argument on the other side of it.
And there have been efforts against quelling that with cigarettes.
Yes.
I remember not too long ago, some of the Blue Zones folks went around and collected a whole bunch of cigarette butts from parks, right? Right,
and then they were talking about a cigarette-free zone, a smoke-free zone downtown, and I had to draw the line at that. I think with the Blue Zone thing, I generally support Blue Zones, but I think they have to. I don't like the idea of using the law to punish people for doing something that isn't healthy. And I think that's where I draw the line. Certainly, we've seen with cigarettes, we've encouraged people not to smoke. They do a lot of ad campaigns, and they've been successful in reducing cigarette smokers without having to put a fine or put them in jail. And that's where I draw the line. I don't think you can punish people for being unhealthy.
So what lessons that have been learned from the past, from either the alcohol prohibition era or the drug war, do you think can and should be applied to what we're debating today?
Well, I think that, as I said, I believe that the alcohol prohibition is an exact parallel, and we're going to see the exact same process if we can ever finally get rid of drug prohibition or marijuana prohibition. Canada just got rid of it. Uruguay has gotten rid of it completely, and I think that day's going to come. And when it does, the gates are going to open, and we'll see that it's not nearly the thing everybody was afraid of, just as it was with alcohol.
Think there's kind of a fear of the unknown there?
Yes, I do. And there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, because a lot of the people that are opposing it were the ones that were smoking in college. And, they have to live with their own hypocrisy, I guess.
Well, Phil Studenberg is an attorney here in Klamath Falls and a city council member who is a strong advocate for Measure 18112, which will be on the November ballot here in Klamath Falls. Phil, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to come in and educate us on this important issue.
Thank you. Anytime.